From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
40 years ago this week, President Lyndon Johnson announced he would not seek a second term as president. His popularity had reached an all-time low because of the Vietnam War. Today, we continue our series 1968, 40 years later. We'll look at Johnson, the Tet Offensive, and the Orangeburg Massacre, when police opened fire on black students protesting segregation at a South Carolina bowling alley. 3 students were killed, 27 wounded.
There was blood all over the place. I mean, people were lying around, yelling and screaming, and the poor nurse on duty, she was a mess. She, you know, I mean, she'd never seen anything like that. It was worse than any combat situation. It was, let's put it this way, it was probably equivalent to a combat situation in war.
We'll hear from some of the survivors and speak with the only person jailed as a result of the Orangeburg Massacre, Dr. Cleveland Sellers. But first, the green light. British lawyer Philippe Sands follows the Bush administration torture trail and holds out the possibility of war crimes. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Iraq, at least 6 civilians have been reportedly killed in a U.S. airstrike on Basra. Iraqi police say the victim's home was destroyed in the attack. Meanwhile, reports out of Hilla say U.S. forces called in helicopter strikes earlier today. Both Basra and Hilla saw major fighting last week as U.S. and Iraqi forces launched a crackdown on Shia fighters. More than 500 people were killed. In Baghdad, residents of the Shia neighborhood of Sadr City say they remain under siege.
These masses that you are seeing are living in this daily situation. It is so hard to transport the sick to the hospital. The masses that you are seeing are only part of the people that left early in the morning to work. We call for the government to find us a solution, or we will stage a sit-in. This time the sit-in will be terrible. It will be a sit-in, not fighting with weapons.
Aid convoys have struggled to reach Sadr City residents despite an official end to the crackdown. An Iraqi Red Crescent spokesperson said food is growing scarce.
These families made an appeal to all humanitarian agencies because of the military operations that have happened in these areas, which have led to the sealing off of the areas. This led to the consumption of all the foodstuffs.
President Bush is in Romania today for the NATO summit, the last of his presidency. On Wednesday, Bush pressed U.S. allies in increasing troop commitments in Afghanistan.
We must win. I agree completely. To ensure that we do win, France is sending additional forces to Afghanistan. The United States is deploying an additional 3,500 Marines. Romania is adding forces, as are several other allies. We ask other NATO nations to step forward with additional forces as well.
Bush is also pushing the eastward expansion of NATO to include Georgia and Ukraine over Russian objection. The exiled leader of Hamas has announced Hamas will agree to a Palestinian state along the 1967 borders with Israel. In an interview with a Palestinian newspaper, Khalid Mashal said Hamas has accepted the 2006 prisoners document drafted by members of different Palestinian factions. The agreement calls for a Palestinian state in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. Earlier this week, the Arab League renewed a 6-year-old peace proposal based on similar terms. Successive Israeli governments have either ignored or rejected the offer, which would require the dismantling of Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization is reporting dozens of Palestinians have died while waiting for Israeli permission to receive medical care in Israel. The WHO says 32 Gaza residents have died awaiting treatment since October. The victims range from a 1-year-old child to a 77-year-old man. 6 of the dead were waiting for the permits. Others were denied permits because Israeli officials labeled them a security risk. Others had received permits for themselves but had to await Israeli permission to admit Palestinian doctors, and others died while waiting to cross the Eretz border, crossing into Israel. In Zimbabwe, final results show the main opposition party Movement for Democratic Change has narrowly won parliamentary elections. The MDC won 99 seats, while President Robert Mugabe's party won 97. Presidential results have yet to be announced, but Mugabe appears headed toward a runoff vote against MDC leader Morgan Tsvangirai. In Ecuador, lawmakers have approved a ban on foreign military bases. If approved by voters, the measure could bring an end to the U.S. military base in Manta. Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa has previously said he would not renew the U.S. lease on the base when it expires in 2009. On Capitol Hill, Senate and Republican leaders have unveiled a new plan to address the nation's housing crisis. The $15 billion measure would mostly benefit the home building industry while offering little to millions of homeowners facing foreclosure. Lawmakers rejected proposals including allowing bankruptcy judges to modify mortgage rates in individual cases. Struggling homeowners would mostly benefit from $100 million allocated to counseling services and increased leeway for local authorities to refinance mortgages through tax-exempt bonds. Home builders would get the most assistance, with $6 billion in tax rebates. Dean Baker of the Center for Economic and Policy Research said, quote, "It's a bipartisan effort not to help the right people." In other news from Washington, Federal Reserve Chair Ben Bernanke has acknowledged for the first time the U.S. may be in a recession. Speaking before the Congressional Joint Economic Committee, Bernanke said, quote, "A recession is possible." State officials and environmental groups have filed a lawsuit seeking to force the Environmental Protection Agency and the White House to determine whether greenhouse gas emissions endanger public health. The suit comes 1 year after the Supreme Court ruled the EPA has the authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate the emissions. The court found the EPA had violated the Clean Air Act by improperly declining to regulate new vehicle emission standards to control the pollutants that scientists say contribute to global warming. But 1 year later, the Bush administration has yet to take any action on the ruling, despite a recent EPA task force finding that the emissions endanger public health. The Supreme Court has refused to hear a lawsuit from Puerto Rico seeking FBI files in the killing of the Puerto Rican independence leader Filiberto Ojeda Rios. Puerto Rico had filed the suit after the FBI refused to hand over information on its killing of Rios in September 2005. Homeland Security Chief Michael Chertoff has admitted hundreds of thousands of immigrants awaiting citizenship not be granted legal status before the November elections. Democratic Senator Ted Kennedy says 580,000 immigrants awaiting citizenship likely won't be allowed to vote. New details have been revealed on government collection of Americans' personal information. The Washington Post is reporting so-called fusion centers established following the 9/11 attacks have collected a more extensive array of data than previously known. According to government documents, the fusion centers collect cell phone numbers, insurance claims, credit reports, financial records, and names of relatives and associates. The information is shared among law enforcement officials nationwide. In South Dakota, abortion opponents are reviving their campaign for an abortion ban 2 years after voters defeated it. The group VoteYesForLife.com says it's collected 3 times the needed signatures to put an anti-abortion measure back on the ballot this November. 2 years ago, South Dakota voters rejected a measure that would have allowed abortions only to save a woman's life. The latest measure is slightly less restrictive, also allowing abortions in the case of rape or incest. In Virginia, Governor Timothy Kaine has stayed all executions until the Supreme Court decides on the legality of lethal injection. Justices heard arguments in January in a case challenging whether lethal injection amounts to cruel and unusual punishment. A decision could come before the court adjourns in June. And here in New York, prosecutors rested their case Wednesday in the trial of 3 police officers accused of killing Sean Bell. The unarmed Bell died on the eve of his wedding day in a hail of 50 police bullets. For its last witness, prosecutors called the emergency room surgeon who treated Bell's friend, Joseph Guzman, who was shot 16 times. The surgeon, Dr. Albert Cooper, said Guzman nearly died from several intestinal wounds. Defense attorneys for the officers begin presenting their case today. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.